Thank you, Sister, for the opportunity to
Deacon
come.
Ray is a deacon in our diocese, but he was once a professor of theology, wasn't it?
Yes.
With the Jesuits. He's a product of the Jesuits.
Well, Sister, I want to thank you, first of all, for choosing for your Lenten series this topic. It's really the whole gist of the Gospels and the New Testament, the joy that's involved with being involved with Jesus Christ. So it's a very powerful beginning. This is meant to be as much of a dialogue as we can do. So please, I hope you will. What I've tried to do here is pull together some of the key thoughts in this first chapter. Okay, and the most central thought in this whole 82 pages when it first came out, when it was first printed out. The most central thought is the one that you see right there in Romans 1, where Pope Francis says, "I dream." This is his dream, you know. I have a dream. Martin Luther King had it. He's got a dream. His dream is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything. Yeah. So that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably challenged for the evangelization of today's world, rather than for her self-preservation. In the past, at least the past 50 years that I've been observing the papacy, it has not always worked that way. It's been for the preservation of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, which is important, and it's good, and it's necessary. But what he's saying is, if we go back to the Acts of the Apostles, we see that this movement that Jesus began was a missionary movement. And he's really trying to say, and he says it so well, is that there are ways that we have forgotten that each one of us personally, men, women, children, teenagers, we are all missionaries. And we get that through our baptism. We are called forth. And he uses it in Italian, he uses an awfully nice word for this. It's avanti. Avanti. It means get going. Let's go. Let's go. Avanti. Yeah. Go forth. Go forth. And he spends, in the first couple paragraphs there, he spends a lot of time trying to show you how Abraham was called upon to get going. To leave where he was, the Ur of the Chaldees, cross over and keep going, to the land that I will give you, that kind of thing. And he talks about Moses, who said, get going, my people are in Egypt, I want you to go there. Yeah. And Jeremiah, some of the great texts of Jeremiah have to do with going forth. And of course, Jesus sending the 72 out, go forth. And of course, Pentecost was the big opportunity. The Holy Spirit saying, okay, now we really have to go forth. So that's, and of course, Matthew 28, go forth, baptize all nations in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So all of that is very much a good beginning. And he's saying, when each of us feels that Avanti coming to us, it's really asking us to go forth. But notice what he says, from our own comfort zone to the peripheries. It's like saying, hey, I want you to try to think outside the box. Think outside the parish. Think outside the diocese. Think beyond. Look beyond. So what the message seems to be here in the early part of this first chapter is that we really need to ask ourselves, when we go forth to the peripheries. He uses this term peripheries a lot. When we go forth, what is it we're challenging ourselves to do? Because it's so easy to live in a parish. Sometimes it's so easy to live in an association. It's so easy to live within an order or a community. But what about going forth to the peripheries of my life? So what are the peripheries of my life? It's a good challenge. It's a good challenge. And he says, very humbly there, if you see a B of the first point, he says, let us try a little harder to become an evangelizing community. And what is that? That's a community that is supportive of one another, a community that's filled with joy, really filled with joy. It's like Snoopy and the dog, you know, when he stands up and shakes, you know, that's filled with joy. And rejoicing in every step forward, every small victory, and the beauty of the liturgy. The Holy Father is very quick to say that God is helpful to us in the beauty of the liturgy. We can't forget a great line from St. Augustine in the Confessions. Augustine, at the end of his life, he's talking to God, and he says, late have I loved you, O beauty ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you. You were with me, but I was not with you. So the Holy Father, the beauty of the liturgy is what shows us God in a very deep spiritual way. So he's talking about that. And then as we move on here, he says, and you see that very clearly, he says, let us be permanently in a state of mission. Permanently in the state of mission. In other words, just as those early disciples that went forth, you know, they were going on mission. And so the early part of the church was simply mission. It was a mission activity, you know. And so often we forget that. My wife Jean and I, for 5 years, were the mission coordinators for the Diocese of Santa Rosa. And it was our job to make sure that every one of the 42 parishes had a missionary that would come in, preferably a foreign missionary, you know, sometimes women, sometimes men, but missionaries who had come a long way, who had given up their whole lives for the sake of Christ, and tell the people about that. And the more I think about that, that is so good that we hear what other people have done as missionaries. And we marvel at some of the things that people have done with their lives to be missionaries and to go through all sorts of pains and troubles to be that. And at the same time, it was not a good thing to do. Because if we had really realized what Francis is trying to tell us, we would all been on mission. We've been on a mission ever since we were little children. We've always been on mission. And so when they came to us and they said, look what we're doing in Tanzania, this is what we're doing in South Africa, or over in the missions, you know, that sort of says, we're missionaries, you're not. We've come to tell you what missionaries do. And that's the very thing that Francis is talking against. He's saying, he's not putting missions down, but he's saying that what we need to do is that we all need to live in a permanent state of mission. And that's very challenging. That's very challenging. A permanent state of mission. How can I be a missionary to my neighbors next door? We all know neighbors can be mean, ugly. Well, you know, neighbors sometimes can be very cantankerous. How can I be a missionary to How can I be in a state of mission in my neighborhood, in my parish, in my diocese, in my country, you know? And this is where Paul VI, he quotes Paul VI very nicely. He says, Paul VI, he says, is this vivid and lively self-awareness inevitably leads to a comparison between the ideal image of the church as Christ envisioned her and the actual image which the church presents to the world today. The struggle to correct those flaws introduced by her members, which her own self-examination, mirroring her exemplar Christ, points out to her and condemns. So, Paul VI was really quite a missionary in his own way. And if you go back to the document on ecumenism, Unitatis Redintegratio of the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II says clearly there needs to be an openness to a constant self-renewal. An openness to a constant self-renewal. And Francis adds, there are some ecclesial structures that can hamper efforts at evangelization. What is needed is new life and an authentic evangelical spirit. A new life. That doesn't mean other people who have life. It means a new life in each one of us. Even us old people. Well, I'm 6 months older than my pastor. In any case, and he says, as you see there very clearly in number 3, that this is a church renewal that cannot be deferred. And it's what he was talking about when he talked about his dream of a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything. And he quotes John Paul II, too. He said, where John Paul says, all renewal of the church must have mission as its goal, if it is not to fall prey to a kind of ecclesial introversion. Ecclesial introversion. Looking back on ourselves, you know. It's interesting, the next statement there is one that he drops out of the sky. And he says, the parish is not an outdated institution. He hasn't talked about parish. He's presuming that virtually everybody who reads this will be thinking already that a parish is an outdated institution, and there should be other things other than parishes, you know. So this is sort of a shock when you first read this. He's not yet talking about parishes. And he says, well, it's not an outdated institution if, you know, he says, a parish can assume quite different contours depending on the openness and missionary creativity of home, of the pastor, and the community together working with the pastor. Okay? But it presumes that it really is in contact with the homes and lives of its people and not a useless structure out of touch with the people or a self-absorbed group made up of a chosen few. And that's where it hits sometimes, a self-absorbed group made up of a chosen few. So often we find parishes, I think if you look at the 42 parishes of our diocese, many of those parishes are run by a group of a chosen few. Does that strike home to you at all? I mean, sometimes everything in the parish is done by this group of people. Everything that has to do in terms of contributions comes from this group of people. That kind of thing. And I think what he's trying to say here is that a parish is not an outdated institution, but it is an environment for a number of things: for hearing God's word, for growth in the Christian life, for dialogue, for proclamation, for charitable outreach, for worship and celebration. But he says we must admit, though, that the call to review and renew our parishes has not yet sufficed to make them environments of living communion and participation and make them completely mission-oriented. All through this apostolic exhortation, he's going to be talking about mission orientation, challenging each one of us, each group in the parish, each family in the parish, to a missionary orientation. And then he says, of course, well, beside the parish, there are other institutions. Of course, and you know there's other institutions. There's a women's group. There's the Knights of Columbus. There's a number of things. Coming from Argentina, he knows about the base communities. And there are other groups, small communities, movements and forms, different associations and things.
It's another group.
Some more people are coming. And then he says, and also a diocese is a missionary, is called to missionary conversion. And that's something that he expects every bishop of a diocese, every ordinary of a diocese to. He says, I encourage each diocese to a process of discernment, purification, and reform. Notice, discernment, purification, and reform. It's the mission of the bishop to foster a dynamic, open, missionary communion. But the principal aim of these participatory processes should not be ecclesiastical organization, but the missionary aspiration of reaching everyone. And as he said in those first 18 paragraphs that Sister was making commentary on in the beginning, he expects this mission thrust, this mission impulse, to be something that comes from every one of us. Not just a small group, not just from the pastor, not just from somebody who's read this, but all through. So. Then he goes into the dangers. Yes?
I got a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Can you expand on how he's using the word mission? Because I think we have a pretty, narrow view of that word sometimes. How do you think he's using it?
Well, I think when he says go forth, avanti, go beyond what you're used to, go outside of your box, reach out. And most of us would say, well, I'm very comfortable. I'm very comfortable in my parish, I'm very comfortable in my neighborhood, I'm very comfortable with my family and family friends and all. But he's thinking, is the message of Jesus Christ ready to go beyond that in your life? And the nice thing about his thinking is it's all gospel-centered. He sees us as people like those going forth in the Acts of the Apostles. As an early mission community. And it sort of says we've forgotten so much of that. Yeah, Sister.
Well, I find that in our society today, there are a lot of people, especially young people, giving up on the church. They're not going. Now, I honestly believe those people have faith, but they're seeking for something that they're not getting.
Yes.
And therefore, I think because they're leaving, we as members of a parish see people no longer practicing, and we say, oh, well, that's their affair. But it's hurting the whole message of Christ. Christ wants everybody.
Absolutely.
And we somehow take it too easy when people just opt out of not going. I mean, they have to be free and they didn't make their decision. But by a word of encouragement, a word of maybe a silent prayer, help them to, especially our young people, because if they leave, we're leaving behind us a very atheistic society.
That's true.
And that's what he's hitting at, I think,
That's true.
I mean, there was a group in our diocese now from one parish, and a group of them left altogether.
Absolutely, yeah.
And there was no comment made, good, bad, or indifferent, from any leadership or anything like that. And I was very sorry for them. They're nice people.
Yeah. And sometimes we
That's the
begin to
kind of
blame
missionary
that
now I
on-
see. That's the
We
kind
blame
of,
it on some people, or blame it on other people.
yeah,
And the joy of the gospel doesn't blame anything on anyone.
no.
But the dangers are there. If you look at number 4, this may serve to bring a commentary on what you just said, sister. He says, when the message we preach becomes identified with secondary aspects of the gospel, especially the church's moral teaching. And he has said this on a number of occasions. You know, when people come to the church and ask about the church, well, at Mass today, the first reading at Mass was from Leviticus. And I don't know if you're familiar with Leviticus, but Leviticus is the most negative book of the first 5. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. It's a whole series of thou shalt nots, thou shalt not, you know. And what he's saying is when people come to the church, and when the first thing that they hear is that the Catholic Church has to do with a number of things, and thou shalt not use contraception, thou shalt not be involved with, well, all the different things that we shall not. And he says, you know, that's not the best way to begin an argument. That's not the best way to make a presentation. Now, Leviticus does it, okay? There is one book of the Bible that is thou shalt not do any of these things. But there is something in the heart of those of us who tend to be more moralistic than evangelistic, to say, what is the church forbidding us to do? What is the church, you know, encouraging us to do? And what he's talking about here, he says that, note that the pastoral ministry and missionary style, the style that he's talking about, is not obsessed with the disjointed transmission of a multitude of doctrines to be insistently proposed. So, what theologians or moralists would say might be tempted to put up front, he's saying the very thing that Sister started off with, and that was that each one of us is encouraged to a personal relationship with Jesus. And in that personal relationship with Jesus, anything can happen. Because we will live a life so filled with joy, being a friend with Jesus, walking in a missionary attitude with Jesus. And so what he's saying is the gospel message has to concentrate on essentials, on what is most beautiful. We talked about beauty. What is most beautiful? What is most grand? What is most appealing? And at the same time, what is most necessary? I think you have to give it to him for saying that. You know, let's not start off talking about the Church of Jesus Christ on a negative step. Let's start off with the things that are most beautiful, most grand. You know, think of the thousands upon thousands of hospitals that have come about because of this missionary work that the church started. Think about the ways that people's lives have been so invigorated. The beautiful marriages that have come forth, the beautiful religious orders that have come forth. All of those things, the enormous artwork of Europe. It's just so incredibly beautiful because of the way they were inspired by the life of Christ. Notice of some of the greatest paintings is the Madonna and Child. No matter who the painter was, it was about the Madonna and Child. And then if you go through the Louvre in Paris, one hall after another is the times in the gospel where you see Jesus dealing with people. It's all painted in beautiful artwork. So what he's saying is, you know, that when we go forth in our neighborhoods, And we're told, if people ask us, we shouldn't have to have people ask us, but if we're living a fair, joyful life, people will ask you, what makes you so happy? What makes you so joyful? And we need to tell them about the most beautiful things, about the most grand things, about the most appealing things. And he says, and those that are so important. So by this time, we're over on the second page. I wanted to be sure that what we're talking about is exactly what he was talking about, and for that reason I wanted to type up the words that you'll find in this book when you have a chance to read it. Let's take a moment to say, this is one place where you could get this, but Peter Matthews is here. Peter is going to be, he's a deacon now, recently ordained a deacon. He worked as a hospital physician for many years. And Peter has a message for you if you happen to have your computer handy. So tell us. Would you stand up a moment and tell us?
If you have an iPhone or an iPad, there's actually an app that runs on an iPhone or iPad called Catholic Social Teaching. It has all the social encyclicals on it, including this one. So it's basically, you can get a free electronic copy that runs on your iPhone. So it's called, you go to the App Store in the Apple universe, and like iPhones, iPads, iPods, and just download the free app called Catholic Social Teaching. And one of the documents is, papal documents, and right under Pope Francis is this encyclical.
Thank you. Let's give him a hand. Peter is being challenged. The deacon training program over the last 15 to 20 years has produced an enormous number, well, a good number of married men who are deacons and serving well in our many parishes in the diocese. And now with our new pope and with our present bishop, things are starting up again. And so it's going to be a challenge to train more married men, maybe sometime in the future married women, to become deacons, deaconesses in the church. Are there deaconesses? Absolutely. The largest hospital in Amsterdam, Holland, is called Deaconesses Hospital. So, in any case, so it's a big challenge. I've been involved with the diaconate training program through virtually from the time Bishop Steinbach came to our house and said, "Ray, you teach at the university. I'd like to start a diaconate program in this diocese. Will you help me?" I said, "Certainly I will, and I'll get others to help you too." And so we have a wonderful crop of married men who are deacons and serve the church in many different, not just on the altar, but in the jails, in the homeless shelters, and various things like that. The deacon is meant to be in the agora, out in the marketplace, bringing the message of joy, the joy of his Christianity to all.
I have a question, right?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
we're talking about, in the analogy of your talk, and Sister's talk, the relationship with Jesus. That the relationship with Jesus and the person of Jesus is our model. We're reading this book by Pope Francis, and he does this conveying of joy better than anybody I know. It'd be pretty hard for me or imagining anybody I know to match what he's doing. How do we learn to do what he's doing? He seems to have figured out how to do this naturally. And the issue is, it's one thing to say, be joyful, and it's one thing to see that he is joyful, and he is doing exactly these things. But how the heck do we learn to do that?
Well, he touches on that too. It's, this joy is not just the joy of office, not just the joy of having to have been chosen as the Pope. It's the joy of office that we have is the joy of our baptism. The biggest problem for most Catholics is that we have not really had much time or effort in really going back and focusing on our baptism. Evangelical Christians live out of their baptism. I've been meeting with 12 Baptist pastors in Petaluma. They said, Ray, you're sort of evangelical, why don't you come and pray with us? So we pray every Thursday morning for about a half hour for the success of our churches, And they're always talking about their baptism, of how anxious they are to prepare their people for baptism, to follow through on baptism, so that every time they have a chance to think about Christ, they're thinking about when they went down into the water. They died with Christ. They were buried away with him in the tomb. They rose from that liquid tomb, to a new life of grace. One evangelical met me in the bookstore the other day, and he said that tomorrow is my anniversary when I first came to Christ, down in the water, And I said, hey Jim, congratulations. I mean, that was a wonderful thing. That every day of your life, you think about when you went down into the water and you came up with a whole new life with Christ. So sometimes that's so hard for most Catholics. I mean, I can remember my mother telling me what it was like when I was baptized, how I screamed and yelled, and the water went all over my eyes and things like that. But you had that experience?
Well, no, I was going to say, my sweetheart, she's Baptist, so I hang out with them too. It's close to what you say, but they're amazed when I tell them the joy of receiving the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus in the Eucharist, or experiencing not just the words of a man in the confession, but real sacramental power. When they do discover this treasure in our church, it's a very new experience for them. So to partially answer Peter, I think a sacramental life, and unfortunately or fortunately, whichever side of the fence, went suffering. The joy is really born out of suffering, and you see like the poetry of the saints, like St. John of the Cross. This most exquisite, most beautiful, most sensuous poetry came out of the most darkest time of his life. And this is why joy, in many sense, and many times where spiritual progression has to part company from mere human happiness. And happiness is related to happenings, but joy is that one gift that sustains us in the worst circumstances because it's not human. You're right, it is a supernatural gift. And without a strong sacramental life, we can't really achieve it, I think.
You said that so well. Thank you. Now, he takes the opportunity on this second page, we're at the second page now, where he talks about how in the documents of Vatican II, especially that one on ecumenism, there's mention of a hierarchy of truths in the gospel, a hierarchy of truths that is present in all of the church's teaching. But the Holy Father says, St. Thomas Aquinas, he's quite a student of Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas said that there's also a hierarchy in moral values, a hierarchy. And for Thomas Aquinas, the morality in the Summa Theologica has to do with virtues, the different virtues. And so what he's saying is that Thomas Aquinas is saying is there's also a hierarchy of the moral values, of the virtues. And the highest of the moral virtues are, what would you guess? Compassion. You're right. Mercy. And so the theological virtues are faith, hope, and charity. But how is charity most shown he's saying is, if we're going to start talking about the church, let's talk about the moral values of mercy and compassion and togetherness and forgiveness, rather than talk about some of the more secondary moral things that have to do with, let's say, things like gay marriage or contraception, or what are some of the other major things. In any case, what he's saying is let's start with the moral values that are grand and beautiful and loving, and so he's saying that mercy and forgiveness that is the greatest of the virtues. So he says what we need today is a sense of proportion. Before all else, the gospel invites us to respond to the God of love who saves us, to see God in others, and to go forth from ourselves to seek the good of others. Otherwise, the moral teaching of the church risks becoming a house of cards. If you start off by saying, well, if you're considering the beauty of the Catholic Church, and you're starting with whether the church approves gay marriage, we can show you 35 or 40 different books dealing with something like this. But that's not the place to start. He's saying what we need to do is have a sense of proportion in mind when we go out as a personal missionary in our world to deal with the things that are primary. And so he says in number 5 there, certainly it's the task of scripture scholars and theologians to keep the judgment of the church, to help the judgment of the church to be mature. But he's saying, the other sciences can help us with this too. Different currents of thought and philosophy and theology and pastoral practice can reflect the inestimable riches of the gospel, an understanding often foreign to those who long for a monolithic body of doctrine to be guarded by all, leaving no room for nuance. And that came about too, when some of the popes about 100 years or so ago said the real way of embracing Catholic doctrine is to embrace the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, okay? Because that makes an awful lot of sense. Okay? But at that time, there were also enormous schools right on the left bank in Paris that were teaching other than Thomism. The Franciscans had a whole series of teachers and so there was a whole Franciscan theology that went side by side with the Thomistic theology. And the philosophy of the Franciscans is much different from that of the scholastic philosophy and theology of the Thomists. So what he's saying is, in movements in philosophy, in movements in theology, and different kinds of movements in our world, let's be quick not to condemn this one or that one, till we see how it really does show the beauty of the gospel. Different kinds of philosophy. For example, liberation philosophy, liberation theology was poo-pooed very strongly by the Vatican when that first came out. And yet people have come to realize that the whole gospel movement was the gospel movement of liberation. That Jesus was talking about liberation from what the temple was telling them that they needed to do. And he was saying, slaughtering 250,000 lambs at Passover is not what God wants. God wants the joy of your heart, the conversion of your heart, not bathtubs full of lamb's blood poured over the altar of sacrifice. So Jesus took issue with some of the things in his own religion, and over the years we've discovered that different philosophies, different theologies have helped us to see the beauty of of God in a wider sense. And
So
so he says,
can I ask a question?
yeah, sure.
So, you know, the media, when Pope Francis says, you know, that we should, you know, emphasize more the loving and the positive and the beautiful, the media who takes a snippet is saying, for example, not literally, but they might say Pope Francis is for gay marriage or whatever. I mean, I'm not saying they're saying that, but the point is, the media takes out of context what he's saying. I believe what you're saying is Pope Francis is not at all changing the doctrine, but he is changing the initial emphasis for purposes of evangelization. Is that an accurate statement of what I just said?
Pretty accurate, but at the same time, he's also saying that we need to take a look at some of these things that we have held as sort of the sacred cows, so to speak. So he's calling, for example, in October for a synod dealing with family. And he has sent out all over the world a survey asking Catholic Christians everywhere, what do you think about these issues, especially the issues that have to do with Christian marriage.
What happened to that question rather than sending out? We didn't hear much about that.
We didn't hear too much about it
There was no issue.
here in this diocese. We didn't, and I'm not too sure why we didn't, but that's. But other parts of the world, for example, Germany, every diocese, every parish has a list. You know, and all of that was put together, and all of that was sent to the Vatican as the response of all the Germans in Europe with regard to these key questions on marriage, especially relationship with those who are married like a second time, and whether they are welcome to the Eucharist or not, various questions like that. And so what Peter says, it seems that the Pope is saying that everything it stays the same as it was before. But it's just the attitude with which you approach it and look at the good points to start with. But I think he's also made it clear by the things that he's done in this first year as Pope that it's not going to stand that way. That we're going to listen to what the people have to say. You know?
Well, do you have any idea what percentage of parishes in the United States actually to give their opinions?
I don't have the statistics at hand, but I know where you can find them because yes, you do.
No, I don't.
Oh, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and finish what you're saying, and then I'll.
CARA, there is a group of statisticians at Georgetown, and their company is called CARA, and it's. Peter, do you remember how that goes?
Center for Research in the Apostolic?
What is it?
Center for Research in the Apostolic?
Yes, the Center for Research in the Apostolic. Thank you. Yes. Have you been following that carefully?
Somewhat, yeah.
Yeah. This woman by the name of Gautier is a friend of mine, and she has been doing a lot in these statistics. But there is a book available now. I just borrowed it from the USF library, and it's about all of the surveys that CARA has done, and this is one of them. Yes.
Yeah, Sister Olive Murphy did the survey here at St. Rose, and we got a brief synopsis of what she thought the value of it was. So, and the value is one that, you know, it's very rare that the Vatican asks for your opinion. So this is, you know, getting the survey done is a nice step. But the other aspect of that is when the report does come out, and you do whether you submitted the survey or you just do it now, you can then use the results of the survey as a reference point to compare your parish your parish to what the West Coast is looking like, what the U.S. looks like. So there's value in understanding, you know, what our community is relative to everything else.
And that's tremendously revealing. Some people were absolutely shocked that all the German dioceses, outside of Central Europe, all the dioceses came forth with a very precise, as only Germans can be very precise, überhaupt, right? In any case, but we need to look at what Kara has had to say to us about that. Yes, what's your name?
Peter Keith. I just wanted to mention that Sister Olive Murphy did have a session on that for St. Rose.
Yep.
On the preparation for the October meeting.
Yes.
And there was about 12 people there and Father Dennis. So we went through all the questions, and Sister Olive was going to pull it all together and send it.
Well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Now, that's one parish out of the 42, which is wonderful. But I don't think every other parish has been looking at it as seriously as St. Rose has. But yes, Sister.
No, I just feel that is one occasion now where I would have liked to have seen more lay people speaking up. Where is this questionnaire? We'd like to do it,
Yeah.
Is it still left to the priest of the parish? Is it still left to the leader? I think that's what we're
Originally
saying.
it was, yes.
That's my understanding of a
Every
missionary.
pastor received a copy of this.
Yeah.
Survey.
They all receive the copy, all right, but not all, very few of them distributed. But when you talk about mission so much, my mind thinks in terms of mission at home where we are. And I think for a lay person, lay people today, I think it's their right and their responsibility
Right.
to really ask about this questionnaire. And,
What month was the November? Last November?
Yes.
The deadline was December to turn it in.
The deadline was like the end of December.
Middle of December.
Middle of December. Yes. So the last time that something like this came out, if you remember, it was in the second to last year of Pope John Paul II. He wrote a letter asking the world for suggestions on how the papacy could meet the contemporary world. And he asked for honest opinions from everybody. John Rayfield Quinn, the Archbishop Emeritus of San Francisco, wrote a whole book on that, suggesting all the different ways that the papacy could change in order to reach out better to the rest of the world. That's a fabulous book, but it's responding to the request of the Pope. Now, this is a request of Pope Francis to tell us what you think the church should be like, and especially with regard to marriage. Any other thoughts on that? Yes?
Well, it's just an addition to what you were saying about Pope John Paul. He stunned the Orthodox by putting the ball in their court. He said, "What is the papacy according to you? Be my teacher, I'm all ears." He waited for their response.
Yes.
That's when Olivier Clement, who was an Orthodox theologian, he did a very scholarly work about what the papacy is, which is still part of the Orthodox tradition, actually, but from the Orthodox point of view.
Oh, sure.
But I thought it was very clever.
Yes, I remember Nikos Nisiotis, who was the head of the Ecumenical Center in the World Council of Churches. And he said to a group of us one time, he said, you Catholics are very lucky. You have only one pope. We Orthodox have 7 popes. And they're not always as humble as you might expect. In any case, but returning to this Evangelii Gaudium document, which is really a marvelous work. He says in number 6 there, it's on the second page there, he says, we must be ready to re-examine customs, rules, and precepts not directly connected with the heart of the gospel. Those pastors or lay faithful who accompany others on their faith journey should always remember that the Catechism of the Catholic Church teaches quite clearly, and this is what it teaches, it's in canonical language, so to speak, imputability and responsibility for an action can be diminished or even nullified by these things, by ignorance, inadvertence, duress, fear, habit, inordinate attachments, or other psychological or social factors. And so the task of evangelization operates within the limits of language, what people can understand from what is said, and the circumstances. You know, how are they living? Are they living in a situation of duress, or fear, or habit, of inordinate attachment, or other psychological or social factors? So he's very compassionate when it comes to that. And he says, as it comes to the end, that the church is called the house of the Father, with doors always wide open. There are other doors that should not be closed either. And he says the doors of the sacraments should not be closed for simply any reason, especially the door of baptism. So that sort of tells you how open he is to the use of the sacraments as symbols of the grace that God gives to us. It's one of the things that when someone who has never been Catholic in their lives returns or comes to the Catholic Church, discovers that there are all of these wonderful signs and symbols, that it's not just preaching. The evangelical churches, everything redounds to the preaching. And in the Catholic community, in the Orthodox community, there are these wonderful symbols: the pouring of water, the use of rings, you know, the imposition of hands, the use of bread and wine, the very simple things that show the grace of God at work in the souls, in the spirits of the people. So, and he says, if the whole church takes up this missionary impulse, she has to go forth to everyone without exception. To whom should she go first? Well, you know, to the poor and the sick, and to those who are usually despised and overlooked, or those who cannot repay you. So the homeless, those in the jails and the prisons, you know. That's where the missionary impulse has to reach out to. So he says, let us go forth then to offer everyone the life of Jesus Christ. Now that's a strong statement. Let us go forth to offer, that we're going to offer everyone the life of Jesus Christ. And he says, I've often told people in Buenos Aires, I prefer a church which is bruised and hurting and dirty because it's been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. And so often, I think he's thinking of he's trying to reform the Curia. Because for the last 50 years, we've had two popes like John Paul II and Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, who have gone out to people. And in fact, John Paul II traveling the whole world, but letting the Curia continue to rule the church. And so what that said was basically the Curia was saying, well, they must all come to us. We're the core of the Catholic Church. All those many dicasteries, those 400 or 500 cardinals or monsignors or whoever it is that are running those dicasteries in the Vatican, they are saying, all those people out there, they must come to us. You know, despite what Pope is preaching around the world, despite the theology books that Ratzinger is writing, they must come to us. And now we've begun to realize, and Benedict XVI came to realize that there are some real scandals taking place within the Curia, and that has to come to an end. So they voted him in Francis as a reformer, and he's out there trying to reform. And he's starting first with attitudes. He's asked everybody to renew their attitudes. you know, before any other steps. Just, let's be joyful with the joy of the gospel. You know. And then he's taken some steps. He's changed a number of leaders in the Curia, and a lot more are going to be changed. Things like that are happening. And I think we're beginning to see a lot of great things.
I wanted to share a story about Pope Francis when he was Cardinal Bergoglio that I heard. And the story is as follows. He used to have a meeting when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires with the monsignors and other people who reported to him every, Wednesday night. And he would always, when they'd have dinner together, and he would always leave the meeting early every Wednesday night. And somebody asked him, followed him, and found out what he was doing. And what he was doing was he was going to the public park there where the prostitutes and the drug addicts, and he would spend every night, all night long, in the public park with those people. So we're reading about the words of this Pope, but this Pope walks the talk. And I think, somehow if we could, just like we follow Christ by having a relationship with Christ, I think we can somehow figure out how to do this by having a relationship with Him and understanding more about Him, the man, I think.
Absolutely. I hope you'll always keep telling your deacon candidates that here. So he sort of winds up by saying, more than by fear of going astray, my hope is that we will be moved by the fear of remaining shut up within the structures which give us a false sense of security, within rules which make us harsh judges, within habits which make us feel safe, while at our door people are starving and Jesus does not tire of saying, give them something to eat. So it's a real challenge to each one of us to think outside of our respective boxes. And if your respective box is a closed community, a closed neighborhood, whatever, it's a challenge to think outside of the boxes. Now I need to, are we doing on time? Almost to the end, I think.
Yeah.
Right, sister?
Yes, it's well there, yeah.
There's a couple of things that need to be said. This series is continuing next week. And Dr. Yvette Fowley is here somewhere.
Yes.
Oh, right here. Please stand up, won't you? She's been a professor of French language at Sonoma State. Dr. Fowley is going to talk about chapter 2, which she has already noted is probably the hardest of the chapters.
It's the one negative among the five. Among the prospective speakers, we had a little, not a tip, but who was going to have to do chapter 2, and we'll get through it.
That's the volunteer.
Madame, merci mille fois. And the other thing is that this committee, I'm sorry I missed the committee meeting, but the committee has asked each one of us that are presiding over a presentation to present 2 things to you. So in the back there, it's something to do, the to do. Okay? And the to do is, that I've chosen, is reflect on Zephaniah 3:17. Zephaniah 3:17. I mentioned that to my dear wife Jean, who is a doctorate in education, and she says, Zephaniah? What's that? I said, it's a book of the Bible. You're kidding, she says. And she, well, I take my Bible and look it up. So she looked it up right away, and I said, well, if you're reading the book, if you're reading this, it's in paragraph number 4. It's in paragraph number 4. But that's a statement that the Pope says, I find it thrilling to read this text. So we challenge you to get your family Bibles out and look up Zephaniah. And the second thing that you're asked to do is, and will be asked to do each week, is something something in your own neighborhood. So what I'm proposing is, this week, go out to a longtime friend who is either sick or financially strapped to express your sincere concern. Okay? And bring him or her some sign of hope that will make his or her heart rejoice and see what joy is about. I challenge you to do that. I will try to do that too.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I hope you go away not disappointed, but rather challenged. You know, this book is challenging. Not in a bad way, but one thing I want to say, a few comments are made there, especially by our deacon down here about how Francis arrived where he is arrived. You know, he is a holy man, well, as far as we can gather, and he has a tremendous joy in his life. I just want to say one thing. When I was young, and we heard about the ascension and Jesus going up to heaven, and you know, when life got a little bit hard, I used to imagine him sitting above in an armchair in heaven, and well, he did a great job, all right, it was not our time. And it was only later in life I began to realise, when I came to America then and saw the GM armchairs would kick out something, you know, and I was saying, God, I would have Jesus put us above, you know, but, you know, he's alive and with us. And I think whatever Francis did when he was a young priest, a young committed person, he went into a holy, and God has been with him. And that's why I think our saints too. When we see a virtue, or we feel ourselves joyful, or feel ourselves doing something for something other outside myself, I think we should do that, because he's with us. He's living. He said, I will be with you all the days until the end. Whatever put it into my head, or whatever doctrine I got, is that he was sitting in an armchair. He's done his job, and my job now.